Okay. Okay, great. So I'm Katie Ryan, heading up the Sustainability Communicators group here within the Trellis Network. And today we have Andy and Joe here to speak with us, which is very exciting. And I'll get to them in a minute. I'm going to do just the quick housekeeping items first. Um, we meet monthly. If we haven't gotten a chance to talk, like I put my Calendly link in the recap emails every time. Please use it. These are my favorite conversations to have. I'd love to get to know more of you. In addition to running this group, I also lead content for Green Bitch, the event that we have in February. So always lots to talk about. We record these sessions so that if there is something in here you want to hear again, you can go back and watch it. If there's something in here that's great for one of your coworkers, the Trellis Network is open to all members within your whole organization. So send them this link or invite them to the next meeting. And then if there are any questions where you're like, man, I just don't want to be recorded asking this question or hearing or having that attributed to me, you can just chat me and we'll pause the recording, or I'm happy to ask the question for you. So all of that is on the table. And then these are Chatham House rules. So you can mention the takeaway, but not attribute the person or the organization. Okay, those are a couple of my kickoffs. But Andy and Joe are here because they are presenting at Circularity. If anybody's going to Denver, I will be there. I can't wait to be there. I'm welcome to love to meet with anybody. And come to Andy and Joe's session. And this is kind of like a preview. And when I heard about what they were talking about related to the circular economy and storytelling for circularity, it just struck me as just a welcome topic for this group as well, because of how much we all have to tell stories about our own organization. And it's this time of year where I always felt a little stuck because I was like telling the same story about the same thing. And Andy and Joe are opening up an angle that maybe we haven't thought of. So anyway, with that, Andy and Joe, I don't know if you want to intro each other or yourselves first or go one at a time. But I'm handing it to you.
Awesome.
Yeah,
We hadn't
sure.
we hadn't thought about Joe introing each other, but let's not change it up that much. Why don't we intro ourselves?
You go ahead, Andy. You go first.
Well, I was going to ask you the same thing. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I am Andy Rubin. Excited to be here. Most of my experience uh, is from more than a decade that I spent at Walmart, including starting sustainability at Walmart as the first CSO in 2004, which feels like many years ago now, um, more than 20. And then since then, since leaving Walmart roughly 10 years ago, I started several companies, the most recent of which is called Trove. And Trove powers, I think, still 70+% of all brand global resale. We started the first branded resale program with Patagonia as OneWear in 2016, and that movement is continuing to grow. I am no longer day to day with Trove. I still sit on that board, but I'm currently doing advising work and working with founders. So that is me. I'm excited to be here. And Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Also, really delighted to be here. So I'm Joe McLeod. Hi. I am an engineer. I design endings. At least I do that now. I used to do proper jobs and have do product development, and I worked for some big companies like Nokia and Orange in the past. My last big job was at a company called Us2. We done digital products, apps. Probably most famous for an app, well, game actually called Monument Valley, which was a massive hit. But then I left there and started to look at the end of the consumer life cycle as a space to sort of an investigation initially. I wrote a book in 2017 called Ends, and this is that book. And that sort of a lot of people really interested in that. I've done a lot of talks and conferences, developed a whole training program around it, which I then turned into a thing called Engineering. Wrote a second book called in 2021. I now specialize in helping businesses talk about and develop that consumer offboarding experience. And I've got clients like Logitech, Fairphone, Intuit, Volvo, and I've trained nearly 900 people in how to design the end of the consumer lifecycle. And yeah, I think John got us together, didn't he, Andy? And we I think we
It,
didn't meet initially, but John said you guys should meet, and then I've done a talk at Trove, and we've kept chatting ever since.
yes, we were meant to be bringing our perspectives together here, which is exciting to get to share a little bit of what we've been working on, and we are planning, right, Joe, to show. I can screen share. We're gonna show some slides, and if it works, we're gonna all cross our fingers. Quite a few very short videos as well. So I expect it will be. I don't know. I'm curious, and then we'll have time for discussion. And I'll be curious if what we share, in what ways it's interesting, and what ways it's things that you've already been thinking about, maybe with one new learning, etc. And we can go from there. So with that, why don't I? So I will screen share. We will see. Okay, it is. Let's see. Here we go. Okay,
You did it. Nice job.
let's see. All right, we're jumping right into 1930. We obviously didn't show the beginning of the video for some copyright reasons, but if you could be seeing the screen, that's a story that many of you, probably everybody here, is familiar with. The first, kind of the opening, the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, which is a classic story and kind of in the zeitgeist right now. And the reason we chose to share that story is because any story like this, humans love stories. It's how we organize the world. It's what we're about. And Joe, feel free to jump in. But stories are so essential in our everyday. And as we think about stories and we think about where many of us spend our livelihoods and what we work on, brands are master storytellers, which is probably apparent to everybody here. We thought we'd show just a few clips now, and these will have sound because brands are very comfortable with us showing their commercials, although not The Wizard of Oz. But we can just get a sense of the stories that brands tell. That was 15 seconds, which is amazing to me, with the story in 15 seconds.
Here's to the crazy ones, the rebels, the troublemakers, the ones who see things differently. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So amazing. That is about technology and laptops, of course. Got one more.
Greatness needs a lot of things.
but it doesn't need an audience.
I love that story. That was about 15 seconds. We're not going to show this video, but the more kind of with this set of eyes towards stories, the more you watch and look around you, I think it's clear that stories are everywhere. Every time we see a commercial and advertisement, there's a story that sits behind it that brings you into a place and essentially leverages culture and things that we know to put you in a situation. In these cases, we're talking about to have you buy certain products.
Yeah, so we were really wanted to bring that sort of sense of story to circularity. We go to circularity a lot, and very few discussions really happen around how important that story is in the consumer life cycle. So here we're looking at the three-act structure, which is a very old traditional structure which was observed originally by the sort of ancient Greeks, looking at all sorts of plays and stories and breaking them down into this sort of structure. And we can see how that sort of works when you see this sort of the progression of a story and establishing the characters in that first act, that initial inciting incident that starts the story and develops through plot points, builds tension and meaning, sort of climax and resolution. And loads of stories follow this sort of three-act structure. Go next. So Wizard of Oz is a great example of that. So the Dorothy story progresses through that thing. So initially she is really anxious about protecting a dog from the horrible next door neighbor, which develops into the witch, obviously. And she then runs away, gets caught in a hurricane, and lands in Oz, which is the end of the first act. The second act sees her get ruby slippers, find friends, battle the Wicked Witch of the West. And that third and final act sort of sees that resolution develop. Happen to find the wizard isn't really a wizard and missing a balloon ride and then wishing herself home by clipping her heels of ruby slippers together in this sort of beautiful sort of crescendo of the story. And that story is really critical, but brands tend to really miss out on the later stages of what we have as consumer stories. We do a great job, as Andy's pointed out, with brands really inspiring how we might progress into a story, but they're terrible at pulling us out of that story at the end of and in later stages of the consumer life cycle. Yeah, and so the Wizard of Oz, imagine such a story that has missed those final two acts and has just whet our appetite at the beginning. We'd feel totally lost and not only anxious because Dorothy's trapped in Oz. And that's what I think a lot of consumers feel like. They're trapped in these relationships. And that's what inspires us, is that there's this space which comes together with circularity and brands, which can really start filling up that. And I think, and we think, benefit both parties and build a lot more meaning into consumerism, but also circularity. So we can break down the consumer life cycle into three sections: and onboarding, usage, and offboarding. And we go to the next slide. So brands are great at onboarding, but we really fail at the other stages. And what we've done over, I think, decades is really over distort this onboarding experience. Historically, it was a far more balanced consumer life cycle, but we've overly distorted this space. And now we're at this place where we've got opportunity to build in this sort of this in this other space. There's such a lot of value in here, not only as brand equity, and we miss out on laying down memories and experiences for the consumer, but bonding and completing great circles in consumer experiences with circularity. And these are the sort of opportunities I think we want to explore in our sessions at Circularity this year.
And I thought we'd just take an example of what we experience with, I'm gonna use the North Face, but we could have picked any one of the apparel brands. This is Act One. In Act One, is incredible as a brand. This is again the North Face, Never Stop Exploring. But this is like the beginning of the Wizard of Oz, right? You're there, you're excited. And then this is Act Three, right? So we go from this idea of putting yourself outdoors, experiencing what you will do with a piece of apparel, to communication around landfills. Complete the circle. Roughly 70% of shoes and clothing end up in landfills. Let's change that. So you start with this beautiful story, but then as a brand narrative, as Joe pointed out, we don't see Act Two and Act Three. It's just like seeing the beginning of Wizard of Oz and having the credits roll. And that, we believe, is a massive opportunity for brands to begin telling Act Two and Act Three in the same way that they do an incredible job of telling Act One. We believe that if brands fully leveraged their incredible ability as master storytellers to tell Act Two and Act Three, the nature of circularity would be approached in a very different way. So, as opposed to needing to approach circularity as a material flow or kind of a scientific need, imagine approaching that as narrative. We thought we'd present, I think there are a few examples out there of where brands are doing this. Automotive is probably maybe the leading sector in where you purchase a car, but then you do see the use of the car and maintenance, and you do see a trade-in at the end, or kind of an end, but not really as fully as we believe could be done. We also, Apple is probably one of the closer examples. Again, not perfect, but will just provide some good fodder. So here is three quick Apple clips.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
Ready to get started?
Well, not quite. Got a lot to do. What's your big plan?
I might make a home movie or maybe create a website, try out my built-in camera. I can do it all right out of the box, so what about you?
Well, first I got to download those new drivers, and I got to erase the trial software that came on my hard drive.
Sweet.
And I've got a lot of manuals to read.
You know, it sounds like you have a lot of stuff to do before you do any stuff, so I'm just gonna get started because I'm kind of excited. Let me know when you're ready.
Actually, the rest of me's in some other boxes, so I'll meet up with you later.
Remember that campaign? That's Act One. Let's take a quick look at Apple playing up now based on that Act Two and Act Three. And again, we think that there's more opportunity here, but it does provide an example.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
And I'm a Mac genius.
A what?
Oh, CPC, every Apple store has a thing called a Genius Bar. It's a place where people like her will answer any questions you have about your Mac.
Like if you want to go wireless, you want to transfer your files over to a Mac.
Oh, a genius.
Mm-hmm.
All right, then. What's the square root of 4,096?
64.
What's pi to the fifth decimal?
3.14159.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I loathe Mac?
11.
Ooh, she's good. Very good.
Act Two.
You've done great things with your iPhone. But at some point, you'll be ready for something new. You can easily trade it in with Apple, so it can be refurbished and put back into the world, so someone new can do their own great things with it. But if your device is at the very end of its life, materials inside will be recovered and recycled. Either way, you can continue to do what you love while respecting the planet. Apple Trade-In. Do one last great thing with it.
Act Three. An example.
Thanks, Andy. So we were looking also at like the arc of the story, the consumer life cycle, and how we tell stories, really, like films, books, and even games. So there's often a primary narrator at the beginning of these stories. This can also be about music and typography and the pace that the story starts to evolve. We get introduced to like the wider story through messages and symbols. This is things like establishing shots as the camera pans down into a scene. It tells you things like where you are, sort of what period you're in, and a context. Is it a city? Is it a rural setting? And then you get introduced to actors and actions, and then the resolution of the story starts to take place, and then you get those sort of consequences and finales. And then you back up out of that story through again a thing called a re-establishing shot is quite common in film, and then sort of the pace of those sort of typography, music, etc., etc. Topped and tailed really nicely and really thought through, always emotionally thought through. And what we do with consumer experience is doing that onboarding phases really well, really branded. But offboarding, we're telling the consumer dry, emotionless stuff, things like chemicals, where to do this, what sort of plastics it made from. These are cold, boring things. And so the brand damage that we do by not engaging with the rest of the consumer life cycle is atrocious. We spend such a lot of money building brands, spending money on adverts and putting so much money into marketing, positioning, and that personal relationship, and just throw it away with poor communication and brand presence in later stages of that consumer life cycle, to the point where we really miss opportunities in laying down good memories and building a long-term relationship.
Joe, what if we just stop here and have some discussion?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Really looking forward to it. Quick questions, I guess.
I'll go first. Um, what what's the evidence that people care about the end? Because like Andy, that picture you showed of the third act of all of those clothes on, that wash up on the shores of countries that don't want it. Um, like that's not really a story I feel like people want to tell. Um, so is there evidence that people want to hear the end?
I, I could probably speak to that one, Andy. Um, Humans love stories, and the end of the story is particularly powerful as how that brings that meaning and purpose together. What we tend to have done over, well, almost centuries is we've broke the consumer life cycle apart, and the end of that consumer life cycle has become a legislative scientific experience. So we use terms like carbon tonnage and plastic terms. The consumers abandoned really at the end, and I think we've got to into a space which has normalized that to such a degree that we can't think outside of that box now. So introducing how we can create stories that last longer than the sales cycle, I think, is really critical.
And I would also add that it's not three distinct parts of the story. When we look at the first act of The Wizard of Oz, the storytellers understand all three acts in Act One. And so we're not saying just do a better job of adding a third story that's just bolted on. We're saying think of the product life cycle as a narrative in itself. And when you're telling Act One, when you're setting up the very beginning, think about Act Two, the usage of the item itself. That's the reason we make and sell these products to begin with. Think about Act Three in terms of what happens, the memorializing, the stories, the narratives. That's where brands are built. So I doubt that Act Three is going to be about landfills. Ideally, and I think Apple was closest to this, but still, I think there's a lot more opportunity than Apple has taken advantage of, even so, in how when you engage with a brand, part of what makes the life of the item and why you buy it beautiful is the full arc of that story. Not just that you buy an item, then you just story about using it, then a story about it going away. It's actually one story with three different pieces. And what Joe and I both see in the world right now is brands spend almost all of their money on Act One without really thinking about what happens when we bring that item home, and certainly what happens when we no longer need or want the item.
I've got a question here, Andy and Joe. I think, and Andy, you just touched on it a little bit, but maybe if you could just touch on this again. But like, what would you say are like the general core topics or items for brands to focus on in each act?
Yeah. Joe, do you wanna start or
I think it needs to start with, or rather, it should carry on with emotion. We have so many emotions as humans to engage with meaning and purpose, and we do pretty well in terms of building that up at the beginning, and arguably, in many cases, having purpose in the usage period. Emotions, when you think about, Andy mentioned memorial earlier, the emotions that we have at the end of other experiences, whether they be in our lives or witnessing death in other people's lives, are incredibly profound and meaningful. And we've got approaches around that which allow us to have reflection, build meaning and memory into that as well. So I think it should always start with emotion in my mind, and I think we fail emotion in circularity so often.
and that all comes back to why we make these products, why we work so like why these products exist, why these brands exist in the first place. Right. And I think in the last 20, 30 years, so much of that has been about CAC and how we get a product into someone's hands. But when we reflect on Act Two, the usage of the item in Act Three, it pushes us to go a bit deeper. And I think that's going to be important, especially in the world of agentic commerce and what we're coming into, to be more intentional. Is probably the right word. To be more intentional around why we make the products in the first place, how people are able to use them, what happens in the end. And Apple's kind of from the three segments we showed as the Apple example, that was when you think about the Mac jumping out of the box, it's about approachability and ease. And, it just fits about your lifestyle, not about the technology. The technology is supposed to bleed away. And that really was the idea of having support along the way and making memories, right? About the photos, not about the camera. And then the idea of allowing someone else to do that was their arc all the way through that. So I think the same for whether we're talking about a jacket or a tent or any other piece of gear, an accessory. Why do we make the product in the first place? And how does that thread push us to be deeper in all three acts?
So, and just a quick follow-up to that, would you say kind of generally, again, speaking that like Act One is the why we make the product, Act Two is the what happens when people use the product, Act Three is what happens in the end of the of that life cycle?
Roughly, yes. And when you think about Act
Okay.
Two, if I decide to buy a Nemo tent in Act One because of the idea of the benefits and the tin and a bunch of different reasons about the narrative about what I will do camping and outdoors. Act Two is there's so much opportunity for a brand and Nemo in this case to stay with me and understand how that's working, how it's not, what's going well, what's not, where can I be going with this? What is the whole point? And then at the moment that maybe I have kids and can no longer use a two-person tent, I think there are whole ideas of what happens next. And right now, what we do is at Act One, where we describe what I can go do after buying a Nemo tent, Act Two becomes buy another tent, and Act Three becomes buy another tent. And so we kind of end up in a loop of Act One, Act One, Act One. And if we think about the products we make as having Act One, Act Two, and Act Three, we'll be able to, I think, and we will need to create deeper relationships with why brands, why these products exist in the first place.
Great. Thank you.
You guys have a couple of great questions in the chat as well. One about how you would advise organizations who don't have a physical product. So something that's not in that B2C space. And then another question on like, man, what if we haven't got our Act Three totally figured out? What can we do? So
Yeah. Joe, I don't know what you think. I don't see any reason that the narrative, to me, the narrative is this, it's the same for a physical product and a service. Either way, you're going to start a relationship. Customers will come meet a service or a product at some point, have a usage of a service or a product, and then at some point be ready for another service or another product or start to separate. So maybe Joe, you might have thoughts on that. We can go to the second
Yeah,
question after.
I think we've done a similar thing with digital as we have with the physical product lifecycle is build stacks of meaning into the potential and onboarding of that thing. And if you look at I'd say data ignorance to most consumers, I think is a really similar type of confusion and very complicated legislative or chemical or material language that we see in other phases and the consumer's similarly sort of shamed into like, you should be responsible for your data. You should be responsible for your waste. You should be responsible for the plastics. And arguably, no humans or like consumers don't tend to go out and buy plastic in Act One, but all of a sudden plastic turns up in Act Three, and I'm shamed because I own plastic. And I think we've got to change the language in some of these conversations to have a consistent, supportive, nurturing relationship with the consumer, which helps education as well. So whether it be I've got no idea where my data is, I see the same problem with ignorance around plastics. I saw DJ had his hand up. Hi DJ, if you're still here.
And we can either now or come back to. There was one other question that I think was in chat. We can come back to
Oh yeah, sorry.
right before DJ. So that's the second question was, what if you don't know Act Three? So the second question, and if you don't know Act Three,
come to our workshop. That's what they should do.
And yes, and my advice would be, I think this is another way of being more customer centric. No one buys a product because one of us owns it. No one purchases a product to help someone who owns a P&L, right? We purchase products based on what we need, the experience, the value, the things we're trying to accomplish and do in our lives. And I think that the deeper understanding of that doesn't mean we need to know everything about Act Three or even Act Two. But I think the mindset of understanding why people buy these products in the beginning and how we use Act Two as a way to create a deeper connection. One of the exercises that we will likely do in the workshop is to imagine, right now, 99% of all revenue comes from selling products. What if 10% of a brand's revenue didn't come from selling products? What if it came from supporting brands as we owned the products? What would that look like? What would the services look like? What would those experiences be? And we can see little glimpses of them, like Arc'teryx is a brand that right now is rolling out service centers in many of their stores where you can bring an item back. There is more connectivity with more products than we've seen before, but I think we're very early in that. So my advice for figuring out Act Two and Act Three, be more customer centric on the reason we all want to meet the brand in the first place.
And just to follow up on that, I think one of the things that we felt developing this sort of program of stuff was that having brand teams and circularity teams a bit closer to one another, having common needs. And I think there's a lot of opportunity just inside your organization to go and make friends with each other.
I think the brand people have more of the money as well. So
yeah, that
if you're on the
is a critical point.
Oh, great. Okay, well, let's do one more conversation on money and then go to your next piece. Great question about justifying spending more time on Act Three versus Act One, where companies have been so focused. Like, what's your pitch to a CFO who's like, I mean, Act Three is nice, but it doesn't actually bring more people into the pipeline. What would you guys say?
Chuck, do you want me to start? My comment would be, I think we've been very uncreative about Act Two and Act Three. Massively uncreative. It does not bring money into the pipeline per se, because we really don't have an Act Three right now. For the first time, even as I sit adjacent to Trove these days, I am seeing brands for the first time make more dollars, not just more margin, but more dollars on Act Three, because they are pulling a product back and creating more margin dollars, gross profit dollars, by keeping it a second and third time as we use up less of the product on every go for every owner. So I think there's opportunity there. as we look at what the cost of customer acquisition and the cost of loyalty are, CFOs will start to realize this is just a lever that can be pulled that's going to be more efficient than simply handing all of our money to Meta, right? As those platforms gain greater purview and being able to charge more for customer acquisition, et cetera. So there's a lot of, and I know brand storytelling and equity are some of the hardest ones for CFOs. They are longer term bets, but there are things that I think there are stair steps into that start to make some sense. So I think we could be a lot more creative. And if you look at things like automotive, most car companies make far more money in Act Two. Very few car companies make money, at least dealers make money in Act One. And the money comes when people service the vehicle throughout its life. The money comes when people trade in that vehicle and you get in the current model. So I think that there are different models for this. I just don't think consumer companies have focused enough on what if we were trying to make more of our money in Act Two and Act Three? What would that look like?
Just to follow up on that, I think what I find, especially dealing with endings, when I go and talk to people about that, I have a little test, and it's that people would say like, "Oh, if we have a good ending, we'll have a good beginning." And what that says to me is that they spent no time thinking about actually what happens at the end. We're so overly focused with the onboarding, and I see it in a lot of businesses where incredible nuanced vocabulary about how the products attract the customer, what it does for the customer. But when you talk about other periods in the consumer life cycle, and especially within ownership and then ending, very, very poor vocabulary, empathy, understanding of really what's going on for the consumer at those points.
Thank you. This is good. Do you have more things you want to share, and then we can get into more discussion before our time runs out?
There isn't any more, was there, Andy? What's that?
No, I was gonna say that. I mean, Joe and I are sharing our own perspectives, but my sense is many people as part of this network have their own perspectives here of what you all have seen on Act Two and Act Three. So it'd be great to hear from some people, not share questions, but also comments, thoughts. Like, what does this resonate? Have you seen this before? Is this, I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are, what you all have seen in your own organizations.
Not really more of a question again, but I guess, I'm thinking about like, in my organization here, I'm seeing like elements of what you're talking about, but I think it's not like brought into a cohesive story, right? So it's like, I think the elements are there. And what I'm really interested in learning is like, what elements can we start bringing into which act? And so I'm really curious to hear from you guys or anyone else in the call, honestly, about, what examples, like specific examples you might have. And I know we've listed some, but if there's other specific examples of what a company has done in Act One that you think is a really good one to call out, and Act Two and Act Three as well, just to, help at least me wrap my head around like what should we be looking for each of those acts, because I think those pieces are there.
Let's hear from some people.
I don't have an example to necessarily answer your question, but I think in a similar curious way, I'm thinking about, I love the customer lifetime value angle of this, and I think that is a framing that feels really resonant with the marketing teams and in helping sell the why on the Act Two and Act Three. In terms of examples, though, what I'm also really craving is I'm really thinking about brands that do this in an authentic way that doesn't feel like you are just trying to sell more stuff. Because another angle to this could be you're telling me the end of life so that I'm also trading in my product only to buy more new products from you. And how do you actually walk that line in a careful way is one thing I'm thinking about. So would love examples of brands who've done that well too.
We talked a little bit about, because there have been examples where people have done really good marketing, what I would call kind of high value or high, I don't know, expensive marketing campaigns on Act Two and Act Three, but they've really been a dressed up version of not a lot of creativity of what Act Two and Act Three were. So I don't think what we are proposing is that people take Act Three and just say, "Hey, isn't this great? We've got an Act Three." It would be like if we think about, Joe, this is your depth here, but when you think about a death, we don't do that with death. We think about death in relationship to life, right? When we think about memorials and narrative and what a good life means and kind of the depth of that. We don't just cast it off and say next. So I think that we can't just skate over and create great marketing campaigns. We have the opportunity here to do a great marketing campaign is to actually do the reflective work for a brand on why people buy the products they use and their endings.
I think a good example of this, and I see this happening quite a lot, where we celebrate a circular product without actually dealing with the practical stuff of a circular product in detail. So a good example is Cake, the electric motorbike company, which was wildly celebrated a couple of years ago and has now gone broke for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons they couldn't service that last quadrant of the consumer life cycle. Their product was incredible in terms of components, and they thought through loads of things in an academic sense. And we gave them awards to say they were great and amazing circular products. They even won, I think, Fast Company most innovative company twice. And they couldn't pick up a bike from one country and take it to another to get it dismantled. They couldn't take batteries, which are really complicated to ship over borders. And it's the details and being present at the end and later stages in the consumer life cycle to really deliver circularity as a consumer experience, not an academic, legislative, chemical material experience. And that, I think, will be the difference between real circular companies and ones which are, because brand will be there at the same time as well.
I know we have a couple of folks who I love hearing their stories from. Scott, I mean, P&G like must have 1 million stories here. Alex, I know you and I have talked about the work that L'Oreal is doing. Alex, do you want to share a little bit more, and then we'll see if I can get Scott to say something too?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. And thank you, Andy and Joe. I really appreciate it. I'm a sucker for good stories. So, I think a lot of what you said first has kind of resonated with me. And I think it said another way, at L'Oreal, we've been trying for years to start telling the story of our corporate brand, right? And try to get to where a Nike is and try to get to where an Apple is, where they can, earn the right to tell these 15-second stories. But I've often found that, particularly in the topic of sustainability and when we talk about circular economy, um, there's just this tension in like letting go of the need to just like educate and the need to, be incredibly thorough, and that there's this really high aversion and risk aversion to greenwashing, right? And I love the point you made, Andy, about like you can't just jump into Act Three without contextualizing Acts One and Two. But the challenge I find with this topic, what I find with this topic, and our subject content area, really is so much around the we want to be more human, and especially when you're trying to create a successful story and you're trying to create resonance. Connecting, and telling a human story is the first order and the first sort of priority in that narrative. And I find the subject content really makes it hard. We know inherently just how connected these two sort of stories are, right? Environmental health is human health, and like the way we can try to always tie these things together, but the formats don't really ever lend themselves, in my experience, to that very sharp storytelling without a very long build. Apple gets to say, hey, there's a trade-in, program because you've been trained to think of it a certain way for all these years. So the trade-in language seems really quick. they've built towards that. And so for nascent brands, and L'Oreal's not a nascent brand at 100 some odd year old 100 some odd year old company in operation, but when you talk about storytelling, I think we underestimate just how much context is needed, and I always find that tension of letting go, of that need to be incredibly thorough, is often what hinders us from telling great stories.
It's such a good point. One thing that comes to my mind is I don't know why any of us, I mean, especially myself, I don't know why we thought that moving from a linear economy to a more circular economy would be easy. And the work isn't just in telling a better story, it's in having something to tell a better story around. Apple probably does a better job than many, but not a perfect job. And I think one thing that I do admire them for is they tend to play a longer game. And I used to religiously watch kind of WWDC and especially Steve's presentations because he would usually say 4 or 5 things that you wouldn't see for 3 or 4 years. And you could see him setting something up that was going to play out over 5 to 10 years, whether it was security or health. And these are long arcs, and they are willing and they've got margins to invest in building them. And I don't obviously a brand with a different margin structure can't do that overnight, but we can take some of that and benefit from some of that. And I think that's the opportunity.
Yeah, that arc of the narrative, especially when you're kind of confronted with like the attention economy, right? And communicating in the attention economy, it's almost like it wasn't too long ago, but you really appreciated that, to your point, when Steve Jobs would say something, like he was building towards something in those keynotes, like you could anticipate it. And frankly, if you heard it, you could also trace it back. And I think often we're looking to really just constantly experiment with like a punch through sort of message, that we forget that, like, I could lean back on a story I told, a year ago or 2 years ago. That's the thing I always challenge, other communicators on, where whenever I hear like, oh, we've already told that story, like, no, we've not told that story enough, as far as I'm concerned, right? It takes sometimes, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, as many times as it takes in order to get resonance and in order to get retention.
Yep.
Because again, that's the arc of a story.
Right. Right. We are talking about The Wizard of Oz, which is from 100 years ago, because it's a story that we still talk about. Not every story is that story.
Yeah.
Is this resonating with anybody else? This figuring out these third acts feeling like gaps in storytelling or things you wish that you were talking about that you haven't gotten to talk about yet? Kellyanne, go for it.
Hi, everyone. It's my first time on this call.
Yay! You look great.
Enjoyed these things. My name's Kellyanne Vera. I sit at MasterCard, and I am a global sustainability director. And my role is interesting in the capacity where I'm decarbonizing the supply chain. So within our marketing, production, and now meetings and events. And alluding to all of this, I was really excited for the training because I struggle with the storytelling portion, because my side is like so scientific based and really understanding like, the cradle to grave approach within measurements. And in a perfect world, I would love for us to figure out the capacity of being able to showcase campaigns that we do, for instance, urban mobility, where we're encouraging consumers to use public transportation, our Priceless Planet Coalition, which is our way of partnering with other brands and companies to restore different mangroves, rainforests, so on and so forth. But I struggle in trying to figure out, how do we tie that story together with the back end decarbonization portion of, hey, consumers, hey, companies, hey, brands, we're talking the talk and we're walking the walk on the back end. So really interested to see if anyone is navigating through that or what that looks like.
I think benevolence has often sort of relied on an incredibly good data source. So when we've gone out and done globalization, we've basically worked out like, how good is this soil in another country miles and miles away? And we've then how well are these workers protected? And then we package that up into a new product and a new Act One, essentially. And we haven't done the same at the other end as it departs the consumer life cycle. I think Andy's probably got a much better story, probably about data at the end, seeing as you started a massive company around that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was like a straightforward answer, right? But I do think that the single takeaway is that most of the narratives who develop around brands are about getting people to use the product, buy the product now. And when you take a few steps back and go deeper on why people buy the products, why they use them, why the world needs them in the first place, and think about the not just the purchase but the offboarding,
Mhm.
we will be deeper and tell deeper stories. But the stories can't be a substitute of the real work to figure out the story.
Yeah.
And it's not just the telling of it. I think it needs to be figured out. So I think this is an opportunity for any brand to figure those things out.
Awesome. Happy to partner with you all and figure it out together.
And we will for those of you who will be in Denver, we will be bringing in we're going to be joined by Chris Riley, who was the creative director at Wyden and Kennedy for 10 years and worked on stuff. He was behind a few of the ads we just saw. He was behind quite a bit of the Apple work and the Nike work. And so there are craft on telling stories, but I think it's the storytelling craft put together with people on this call who have the depth, and more people in your organization who have the depth of the brands, the products, the services themselves to figure out the story, not just the storytellers. That's where the work is, and I think that's where the value will be.
Maybe just a comment, kind of actually, because Kellyanne, I was thinking similar things with like if like you said, you plant mangroves. What does that have to do with MasterCard? And maybe Andy, Joe, something to think about. Your timeline is still a linear timeline, and if you just wrap that x-axis right around, and you started talking about how does mangroves enable MasterCard to do more MasterCard things. I really don't know what all that involves, but tying that circle back around might help Act Three blend back in and how that enables Act One. And so that's kind of where I've been going with some of this conversation is like how do you tie maybe something that isn't totally connected to a product back to your operations or back to that front end. And I don't know, this has been an interesting conversation.
One other point you're bringing up is we didn't separate much product from brand, but they're obviously very different. And the idea that a product would have a life cycle for a customer might be part of a much larger narrative and future promise that I think a brand would represent as well.
Yeah, we're looking at, I think, meaning within that to the consumer and the human and the brand was that meaning which we're really looking at. To talk to particularly to credit cards, I think Doconomy do a good job with stitching the end to the beginning and making that a really interesting. Do you know who Doconomy are? I'm sure Kellyanne does.
Yeah, we actually use them to power our carbon calculator within our emissions for our.
There you go. But do you want to tell them about Doconomy and how that works with their credit card offering?
Yeah, so we have essentially there was this whole movement to, and it becomes a whole plethora of things. How do you educate a consumer on sustainable consumption without having consumption reduced, right? Because essentially, if you purchase something, you're emitting carbon. How do you find that balance between, hey, we want you to still feel that you can purchase your items, but just purchase something that has a longer lifespan, something that's catering or giving back to the community as a whole, so on and so forth. So Doconomy is plugged, and I don't sit on the product team, so this is very high level, but Doconomy is plugged into our different credit cards and products with our issuers because we're the network. Essentially, we're not a bank. We just power the transaction. And they help provide a spend-based analysis on the emissions that are created based on certain purchases that you make within your card. So you can go into your application and you're able to see your carbon footprint based on your specific consumption. So it's interesting in that capacity. And then, delving a step deeper, we want to shift from spend-based to activity-based, right? Because it's a more granular depiction of data. But when you're thinking about it within like sustainable consumptions and consumers, imagine the data that needs to be plugged in order to ensure that you're getting the most accurate depiction of what activity-based looks like. And that's where it gets very, very tricky.
And the economy built a card based on you aren't spending money, you haven't got a credit limit financially a month, you've got a credit limit in carbon. And I think that tells a really different story that, okay, I've spent enough carbon this month. And there's interesting things around that.
And there's an example in the chat that I think Sally you put in just talking about Lego. When you think about a product that you could view as a purchase a set of Legos versus where Lego has gone over the last 15 years with their brand is really an interesting example as well. That goes far beyond purchasing a Lego set. So without getting too into that, I think that is another interesting example. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I know we only have a couple minutes left. I love these conversations. Andy and Joe, thank you so much for coming to share your stories. I will be at your session, and so I can, of course, come back and share highlights with this group for our May meeting. I'm going to put the May meeting on the calendar. I'll send it around. It's going to be on all these changing regulations. How is that now affecting your comms strategy? Because these things that we thought we were coming and going to be accountable for have now changed. And I know organizations were like, well, I'll ditch my voluntary report, but like now maybe no. So we're going to have a roundtable discussion on that. Andy and Joe, thank you. Now I feel like I really got to have better endings for these calls. So that'll be my next step too. A better third act for sure. Some kind of song or dance. Okay. I really appreciate you guys. We'll see you later. Have a good one.
Thanks very much. Come to our session on Wednesday.
Yay.